My name is Dr. Norm Hare, and I'm a professor of science education at California State University, Northridge. We want to welcome you to this HP Catalyst mini course. This one is called Computer Supported Collaborative Science, and it's one of three that we're developing. The first one, the module that we have right here, is focusing on the collaborative analysis of pooled data. This is a part of a pedagogy that we found that really engages students in the science and engineering practices mentioned in Dimension 1 of the Next Generation Science Standards. And we think it's just basically good teaching. It's student-centered. It involves them collecting and analyzing not only their own data, but also the data from their colleagues. And so we think it represents really the way that science is done in a more realistic way. In other words, we're not looking at just single data points or single experiments, but we're looking at a collection of them. So the analysis of pooled data allows students to start doing some basic statistical analysis, but it's not with some hypothetical data. It's the data collected by their peers. And we see, of course, a number of advantages to this. One is the principle of regression towards the mean, that if you get more data points, you're probably more likely to get a more accurate representation of what the data really is saying. And so the trends that we see in that data are going to be more meaningful. And so in a typical laboratory experiment, an individual submits their own data, or maybe they work in concert with one or two other lab students, but they get fairly limited data points, and it focuses, most of their attention is actually focused on collecting the data. CSCS allows you to collect all of that student data into a common pool, and then you can analyze it and see patterns that would otherwise be invisible to the students. And so again, with more data points, you're more likely to get an accurate mean value or an accurate trend line, which represents the underlying physical or biological phenomena that they're studying. So we're very excited about CSCS, and we found that it is truly a way to engage students in the engineering and science practices mentioned in Dimension 1 of the Next Generation Science Standards. And again, we believe that those more accurately represent what we really want our students to be doing, in other words, to thinking like engineers and scientists. To understand the value of pooling data and then analyzing that data, we're going to look at hurricanes. Now, of course, students can't collect much direct data from hurricanes, but there's a tremendous amount of data that's available on NASA's site, on the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration site. And we can assign each student a specific hurricane, a historical event that they could investigate. Then we can collect that information and analyze it to see if there's any pattern. Over the past 2 centuries, tropical cyclones, hurricanes, and typhoons have been responsible for the deaths of about 1.9 million people worldwide. In fact, large areas of standing water caused by flooding lead to infection, as well as to contributing to mosquito-borne illnesses. Anyone who's followed the news is familiar with some of the devastation caused by Hurricanes Irene, Andrew, Katrina, and many others. And of course, this is something that should hopefully engage the students as they try to figure out the patterns of hurricanes and how to predict them. And so we're going to look at data and see if collectively they can start to do some kind of analysis on past hurricane history to help predict future hurricane patterns. A hurricane is a tropical cyclone, and it's a storm system characterized by a low-pressure center and numerous thunderstorms that produce strong winds and heavy rain. Tropical cyclones may be known as hurricanes in the Northwest Atlantic, typhoons in the Northwest Pacific, or simply as cyclones. And a hurricane is a tropical cyclone with winds of 74 miles per hour or greater that occurs specifically in the Western Atlantic, and is usually accompanied by rain, thunder, and lightning that sometimes moves into the temperate latitudes. In this CSCS activity, each student will investigate a single historical hurricane. They'll look at a track of it on a map. They'll look at its wind speed, pressure differentials, its pattern once it hits land, and try to see if they can characterize hurricanes in general, not by looking at theirs alone, but by looking at theirs in the context of the entire class data, and see if that could be helpful in predicting future hurricane behavior. You can find the CSCS investigations on the sidebar of the website. And right now we're going to be looking at the CSCS investigation regarding hurricanes. And it's right here under Environmental and Earth and Space Science. So when you're making a CSCS investigation, you want to house it in a website, and we'll describe how to do that in a different video. But you want to have it interfacing with various different interactive Google Docs and other types of collaborative resources so the students can collect and analyze their data online. So in this one, each student is given a different hurricane. So if they click on the hurricanes right here, you can see a series of hurricanes there, and I'm just going to sign up there for Ivan, so you can see that I've clicked in there and said that's the one that I want to research. And different students would select different ones. So if you had an entire class signing up, you would just start to see their names. You might see, different names popping in here and so forth, claiming various different hurricanes to observe. So we're just going to look at one hurricane here and then start to see real data from other students in different sections and so forth to look together with your data as well. So the first activity here requires students to first view some footage on hurricanes and then look at some satellite photos to observe patterns in hurricanes. And here's a whole variety of different hurricanes, and if they look at these satellite photos, which are housed in Picasa web albums, but could be housed on any online photo site, they'll start to see that there's some distinct patterns here. They tend to be cyclonic, in other words, they tend to be circular. They tend to all be swirling, perhaps in a similar direction. And as they scan through all of these images of hurricanes, they hopefully will develop some kind of a general concept for what hurricanes look like, at least from a satellite perspective. And then after they did that, they could analyze that in a word cloud software like Wordle or something. We won't do that right now. But then each one is given a specific hurricane to research. In this case, we're going to be looking at Hurricane Ivan using the hurricane tracking tool. So this is coming from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and they're going to search for a storm, a specific storm. In this case, we're going to be looking for Ivan, and you can see that there's numerous Ivans. The one we're interested in is the most recent one right here. And we're going to go ahead and look at that satellite track. And so we can see that the satellite data here that's been now also transcribed with buoy data and other types of atmospheric observations has tracked the eye of the hurricane going along from the eastern side of the Atlantic near West Africa. This would be the Cape Verde Islands right there. So just a little bit south of that, and it's migrating in this one in a westerly direction. And the colors would indicate the intensity of the hurricane in terms of the categories of the hurricane. So when a student kicks up here and says, okay, that this is a H4 or Category 4 or Earth hurricane, you can see that their maximum sustained winds are in excess of 114 knots. A knot is pretty close to a mile per hour, a little bit more. And then they'll see the pattern of that hurricane once it hits landfall here in North America and cycling around, and in this case ending somewhere near Houston. So they'll be actually looking at data for their own individual hurricane, again doing the search over here, looking at the patterns there, then also analyzing the charts. So here we're looking at the maximum sustained winds, And so you can see that here we're at 40 knots and increasing to about 65 knots, and trying to find some kind of relationship between the pressure, which is going to be measured over here on this side in millibars, and the sustained wind, which is going to be measured on this side in terms of knots. And once the students take all that data, they're now ready to enter it into a collaborative document. So they would keep this window open and then enter using the data link right here, which will take them to a form which will collect their data. So for example, I'm just going to put in here that my name is Norm Hare, and I'm looking at Hurricane Ivan, and this was in 2004. And then you fill all of the different questions in based upon your own observations. Well, Ivan is a male name, so that particular hurricane has a male name. And as you would go down, you would enter the appropriate data, looking at, if you looked at satellite photos of the hurricanes, which you could search on the internet for a satellite view of Ivan if one wasn't in that first album that I prepared. And then examining the eye of that to see, does it appear to be clear, or clouds lower than the surrounding clouds, or whatever. And then they would track those dots on the map to try to figure out where was the speed the highest. Was it over land or over sea? And then also trying to look at the track, where in the Atlantic Ocean did this hurricane originate? Did it originate up here near Norway? Did it originate near Spain? And then they would fill in the various different options, and as they put answer the questions here based upon their analysis in the graph, they're going to be adding information to a common database that we can now all look at. So in this case here, the data is submitted now, and so they're now contributing to a set of data. When they click on the back button in here, get back to the main page, and as a class, they can start to see the tabular data that they just contributed, as well as all of their peers. So over here, there's a table of data, and you can see in this case right here that as we scroll across, this is going to be all data pertaining to the various different hurricanes, and you can see that there's numerous entries and so forth in this. And now we're going to see, is there any pattern to that data? When they start looking at the trends in the class data, you can see that all of the data now has been aggregated into one location. And so we can see that of the hurricanes that the students did research on, 10 of them had male names, 4 of them had female names. Again, that was just of the sample that they looked at. You can see that a tremendously high percentage, 9 out of the 14 that were recorded here, occurred in September, and the other ones occurred in either October or in August, but basically around that August, September, October window. Maybe one in November, but beyond that, there was none in what would be the northern hemisphere as winter and spring. In terms of the spin direction, that you'll notice that people notice that their hurricanes almost entirely went counterclockwise. Now here's actually, for the teacher's perspective, would notice that maybe students don't know which way the clock goes, because really all of them should go counterclockwise in terms of their spin direction. And so the 3 over here that are reporting that it's going clockwise probably are either confused about the clock or have a difficult time just interpreting the pictures. Again, for most people saw that the eye or the center of the hurricane appeared very clear. Some said that it appeared, the clouds appeared a little bit lower than the surrounding clouds. And again, it depends on the pictures and so forth, but there will either be a dip or a total absence of clouds in the eye of the hurricane. 100% noticed that the speed was greatest over the sea. You'll notice right here, 14 out of 14 of the people in this particular sample noticed that their hurricanes were fastest over the sea. And in terms of the origin, nobody found anything appearing out of the northeast Atlantic. In other words, nobody cited a hurricane coming out of Norway or England or Spain. Finally, when you get to the northeast Atlantic, in other words, just slightly above the equator, so really the East Atlantic, but still above the equator. So the Cape Verde Islands, 36% of the people cited that their hurricanes appeared to have their origin there. Another 21% said that they saw theirs coming over the Central Atlantic, and then another large group thought that theirs was originating over the Caribbean. But I think it's, again, significant to see that this was not just a random distribution. The students are starting to see there's a pattern. It appears as though the hurricanes, from the data that they have collected here, start near the Cape Verde Islands or off the west coast of Africa or maybe the Central Atlantic, and then build up speed over the water, and then what happens when they hit landfall. We'll look at that data in just a moment. None of them found a hurricane that crossed the equator, and again, that's something that that researchers have noticed, that hurricanes always start north of the equator, at least in the Atlantic Ocean, and progress from the eastern Atlantic to the western Atlantic. Again, 100% were able to read the charts correctly, noticing that that air pressure and wind speed were actually inversely proportional. So as one goes up, in other words, as the air pressure goes up, the wind speed goes down. Again, something that may sound counterintuitive to people, but certainly the data tend to support that. They noticed that when the hurricanes hit land, generally in North America with the hurricanes that are on our list, is that the wind speed decreased. So that the wind speed was always highest over the open ocean and then decreased when it hit the land. Finally, in terms of the track of the hurricane, in other words, the actual path of the hurricane, does the hurricane go straight, or does it tend to arc to the right or to the left? In other words, does it tend to go clockwise or counterclockwise? And in terms of their tracks, 100% of the people said that indeed the hurricanes appear to track in a clockwise direction. And finally, they were noticing that there was, of the hurricanes that they tested, that there's distributed all over the eastern seaboard, but primarily the southeastern, starting at like North Carolina and going down through Texas. None of their set actually appeared in New England, although hurricanes could strike land there, but apparently it's fairly unusual, and certainly the data tends to bear that out. So they have this data, and then they can take this data that they're now seeing the whole class data and enter this into a collaborative report by a different form. So clicking over here on the report option, they click on the report, and then they could take that data that they've seen and observed and actually write it in paragraph form to describe various different observations that they've made by looking not only at their data but all students' data. So about was there any naming convention of the hurricanes? Is there any patterns in the movement and the destination of the hurricane movement, etc. And finally, the teacher can then look at the student report data and see now each one of these going across would represent a different student group. So then we could look at here. This might be yet another one right here. And so that the teacher doesn't have to collect any paper. They can see all of their student reports there in a simple grid and then investigate them without having to collect any paper in a single document. So in review, we can see that the CSCS approach allows students to tackle much larger problems than they could otherwise address. It allows them to see patterns in data, to start looking at things from a statistical perspective. It also helps identify outliers which may be significant or just simply represent poor data collection or poor data reporting. And finally, it allows people to work together to create something that no one could create individually in the same time. And so hopefully you're starting to see the value of the CSCS approach to pooling data and analyzing it as a whole. So we believe that the CSCS approach more closely resembles what scientists actually do. They don't just look at their data, but they look at the data of their colleagues as well, and they start to see patterns in that data. And from those patterns, they start to draw inferences. And we believe the CSCS approach allows you to introduce students to the science and engineering practices addressed in the next generation science standards. And we'll address this more in future videos.